I'm a sophomore elementary and special education major from Pittsburgh, Kansas.
My name is Gabriel Mayday. I am a sophomore theology and philosophy major from Traverse City, Michigan. And what we're discussing today is how kids learn to read, what the research says, which is we're discussing a topic that, as Dr. mentioned, is controversial, but it deals with the two primary types of reading, which is whole language and phonics for instruction.
So we're going to begin just by taking a show of hands. How many of you remember learning how to read? Think you remember not knowing, and then you remember the process of learning, and then knowing how. I'm willing to bet that not many of you really do. And that's true for most of us. We don't remember learning how to read because it happens when we're very young. That can make this topic kind of difficult to research, but it's so important.
And as this stat shows, that 90% of first grade readers who are not successful readers will struggle for reading with the rest of their life. And as we all know, reading is in pretty much everything we do, from the stop sign we see to just any book we're going to have to open in life. So the fact that at first grade, if you struggle the rest of your life, is pretty staggering. So we're trying to look at this stat and say, how can we change that? What do we need to address in order to get this number to be much smaller?
So how do children learn how to read? First, it's important to note that while our brains are wired for spoken language, they are not wired for written language because we invented it. So a baby can learn to talk just by being talked to, but a child cannot learn to read simply by being read to. They have to be explicitly instructed. And most languages can be taught as a code. Letters correspond to sounds called phonemes, and children can be taught these correspondences. So a teacher may write the letter T on the board and tell the children that whenever they see this symbol, they are to read the T sound. However, it's unfortunately not that straightforward. English is one of the most difficult languages to learn and teach because our code is more inconsistent than most. In languages that have what we call transparent codes, like Spanish, for instance, the letters and the phonemes or sounds in the language maintain basically a one-to-one correspondence, but in English, we only have 26 letters for the 44 different phonemes in our language. So this is a huge discrepancy, and even still, some of our letters are redundant, like C, for example, because it makes the same sound as K and S. So because of this discrepancy in letters, we have to make up for it with a bunch of spelling rules that make our other sounds. But even a lot of these do not hold true a lot of the time. A rule that most of us grew up repeating, I before E except after C, is broken in what I would argue is the most common EI word in the English language. There. The E comes before the I, and there is no C in sight. A lot of these spelling rules are broken and are very common words, which is very confusing for kids when they're learning how to read. Educators and researchers wanted to know if there was anything that they could do to prevent this struggle. So over the years, two main methods of literacy instruction have been developed. When we say literacy, we're talking about reading, spelling, writing, all of that. So these two methods are phonics and whole language. All other methods are a combination of these two. So let's look at both of them. Phonics is what we think of when we think of our basic sound-out method of learning how to read. Children are taught the letters in a language's alphabet, and then they are taught the phonemes that go with them. They are taught letter blends, like the ST in stop or the ND in sand, and they are taught digraphs, like the CH in chop or the TH in with. They then are able to use these as building blocks for words. I have up here an example of a nonsense word practice sheet. This is something that a teacher may use if they use phonics instruction, because these words are not real. Children cannot use context or anything else to guess at these words. They must sound them out. So it's a good practice tool for phonics. Whole language came a little bit later. As we already discussed, there are a lot of words in English that are just not spelled phonetically, which makes it difficult or even impossible to sound them out. Educators and researchers saw children struggling to sound out these words and decided that that is not what reading is about. Reading should be about comprehension and understanding, and it should be enjoyable, not so laborious. And as adults, when we are reading, we don't feel like we are reading the individual letters in each word. We feel like we're reading the word as a whole. Hence, whole language believes that letters are relevant, that words should be memorized as entire pictures, like the Chinese did with their logograph system, where they had an individual symbol for each word. You may remember learning sight words in elementary school. I have up here a kindergarten sight word list. These are words that are meant to be read on sight and memorized, so not sounded out. They fit into whole languages theory. The theory also teaches a cueing system, which gives children strategies to figure out a word if they don't know it instead of sounding it out. So the children might be told to look at the first letter of the word, look at the picture if there is one, and ask, what would make sense here? These cues involve knowledge of context and syntax, and they promote understanding of the meaning of the text as a whole instead of just what the individual words are. So there's been kind of a political struggle between these two methods. Like I said, phonics instruction was dominant for a really long time, and whole language came later. It was really popularized in the United States in the 1980s through the early 2000s by a program called Reading Recovery, which was invented in New Zealand to help struggling first graders. So these students would meet with a reading recovery tutor every day and practice these cueing strategies until they were caught up with their class. And at first, it seemed like the reading recovery program was working really well and that children were learning and catching up. But that's because all of the studies that were conducted on it at first were invented by the same people who created reading recovery itself. And so long-term studies showed that while these children did get better at using cues, they didn't actually get better at decoding words they had never seen before or spelling. So it turns out this whole language approach may not have been the best thing after all.
Yeah, so looking kind of, what also developed this time was also psychology, so this particularly the psychology of reading. So, they found two main points. The first one was that when we read, we actually read every single letter we come in contact with, whether or not we're aware of it. So the problem with the whole language approach could seem that like instead of memorizing specifically, you don't know how to read every single letter. You don't know how to put the words and blends together. That's a problem. The second part is memory. Whole language is primarily based on a memory style learning system, and the problem is, as we all know, that the limitations of the human memory, right? So the psychologists are pointing out that the limitations in the human memory made it very hard for us to memorize the over 170,000 words that English has. So English as a whole has 170,000 words that we use. The problem is that is impossible to memorize. We can't come close to that. So what happened? So educators and legislators came together and they decided to develop what we've called the science of reading, which is the research which generally points to the effectiveness of phonics over whole language. So phonics seems to then take a predominance, and to this day, 37 states promote and legislate that you have to teach phonics in your classroom. So kind of looking at then whole language as well, where does whole language also seem to fall short is that in this example that we have right here, right? So this is a Dick and Jane story. We probably remember reading these growing up, but this is really a great example of whole language because it does the repetition of like funny, funny, oh, 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 in the context of the picture. So as you can tell, the boy is playing with the dog and all of the words together. The problem with that is kids were memorizing the words in the order that they came in, not what the words meant or how to use them, right? So it then became associating with funny in this way and not like when they'd see funny again. So the problem was when students would see words maybe they didn't know or they hadn't memorized, they would freeze and wouldn't know what to do because they had no idea where to go. Because the whole language approach had them memorize things in contextual order. So that's a massive problem. So what does this point to, right? So this is kind of a chart that really kind of expresses this so that whole language works really well when there's less information, when you're beginning to instruct and when the information is really easy to process. We can just simply memorize it. The problem is with the green arrow, as it becomes more complex and you need to use explicit instruction or directly teaching certain ideas or principles, it's really hard to try to use whole language as the backbone for that, right? So the example would be like trying to learn math in the whole language approach, right? So imagine we've all learned that 2 apples plus 2 apples equals 4 apples, right? Imagine trying to learn that as 2 plus 2 equals 4 and just memorizing that straight fact. While at first, that's going to seem easier, it's going to be more approachable, and teachers are going to be like, wow, they're learning it really quick. The problem is that when they start to learn algebra, if you don't know how to do 2 plus 2 equals 4, you're never going to get anywhere, right? Algebra is going to become borderline impossible because you don't just plug in, you know what I mean? You don't just plug those things in. So then they look and said, okay, so then what do we do? So clearly this doesn't work. And it's not just this, it shows that the data also represents this as well. So across many studies done, you can see a pre and post test when it comes to spelling. Spelling was kind of blocked up. So this is a spelling test that they did, and a pre-test where it was just to simply give them a list and they could memorize them. Obviously the whole language approach, real easy. The problem is, when you added a factor of time to it, it became significantly harder for them to just be able to write them down from memory right away. And then the phonetic or the phonic way of learning became so much easier, so much simpler, because they could also sound it out if they didn't get it. The whole language approach, you do not have the ability to sound things out, you just simply memorize. So clearly this is definitely showing the whole language is not as effective. So clearly that means that phonics is the way to go. Well, the problem is English really is not a phonetic language. So as we all know, we all have all these rules that we kind of try to remember. But to try to say that English can only be used phonetically is just really, really hard. So the example that we thought was funny, and we probably all remember this, is when the two vowels go a walking, the first one does the talking. Exactly. So, and the problem is that rule only holds up 45% of the time. So we're giving these rules to kids saying, look, this is what happens, and then it only works 45% of the time. That doesn't really work, right? So it's like, what do we do going forward? And we all know that English isn't going anywhere. It's only getting more complex every day. So the question then is, how do we, as teachers and educators, move forward? What do we do to, obviously it looks like there has to be some incorporation of both.
Yeah, so as Gabe said, obviously the most effective method of instructing reading is going to be some combination of phonics and whole language. We cannot memorize every single word in the English language as a picture, but we can't sound them all out either. However, if we learn enough letter combinations, we can sound out more of them than we think, and there's a specific way that phonics should be taught in order to sort of hurdle this complexity in our language. Diane McGinnis is a reading researcher, and she had a really good example in her book on early childhood reading instruction using a hypothetical teacher named Miss Jones who teaches first grade. Here's what her lessons might look like. 1 week, she teaches that the letter C makes the K sound. And then a couple weeks later, she tells the children, this is the letter K. It makes the K sound. Several weeks down the line, she's going to teach the digraph CK and tell the children that this makes the K sound. Now the children are confused. Some of them might be thinking to themselves, wait, that thing that we learned a few weeks ago, it must not have really been K. It must have been something else. I just can't remember. Or some of them might think that all three K sounds are distinct from one another in some way, which is not true. So here is what Ms. Jones should have said. Today we are going to learn the sound K. There is more than one way to spell this sound. I'm going to teach you some patterns to help you remember when to use each spelling. Now the message is clear. So instead of teaching children the alphabet and then going through an alphabetical order and adding sounds to all of the letters, we should be teaching them the sounds first. And actually, I said at the beginning that our brains are wired for spoken language. The kids already know these sounds. Take the sounds they already know, add the symbol. Do not do it the other way around. It's confusing. And then whole language should be used as a supplement to this, as more of an exception than a rule. Many of us have taken foreign language courses where we had to memorize the irregular verbs. This is no different. For those words that have infrequent, irregular spellings and show up often in our writing, children should be taught to memorize those. There's really no other way. They have the space for a limited number of those in their memory. Another implication is to teach reading and spelling in conjunction with one another instead of as completely different subjects, like many schools do. Anybody who has taken a general psychology class knows the difference between recognition and recall memory. In order to read something, you simply have to be able to recognize it, but to spell it, you need to be able to recall it on its own. This is a stronger form of memory. So if you teach a child to read, they may become proficient, but they will probably still struggle to spell many words that they can easily read off of a page. If you teach a child to spell, they will come to the happy realization that they know how to read the words that they can spell. So using these different methods, kids will learn how to read better than they do now.
And ultimately, at the end of the day, we really want this number to become 0, right? So how do we incorporate this? As we discussed, using this method, hopefully this number one day will get as low as it possibly can. And hopefully for future research that we're going to look into, is to take what we've discussed today and apply it to learning disabilities, particularly dyslexia or other reading-based learning disabilities. And then for those who, English language learners, or those who are learning English as a second language, who already have the skills of learning a language the first time in their back pocket, how can we take that and incorporate it so that we can easily teach them English without it being this massively burdensome task at hand?
Yeah, so we're kind of looking at that for the future, but for now, does anyone have any questions?
Have you given much thought? I've heard of people who've learned to read simply by looking over their parents' shoulder as the parents like reading something, but just like for a long time. Like if there's a kid always sitting in the dad's lap when he's reading the newspaper, and they just learn to read at like a really early age just through that. Have you given any thought to that?
Yeah, so all brains are not created equal. So some people can learn to read easier than others. And we know that. We know that if we taught every child the same way, that some kids would learn to read when they were 4 and some wouldn't learn to read until they were 7 or 8. So we were actually just talking about that before we came in here. My sister learned to read by looking over my shoulder while I was learning to read. So that might work for some kids, but generally speaking, those kids who are struggling in 1st grade are not learning to read by looking over their parent's shoulder. So I don't really know necessarily how that works. Those kids who learn to read that way are probably gifted, but
You know, I guess maybe
Yeah.
I didn't explain this at all. So like reading out loud, if you're reading something out loud, then the kid just kind of. I feel like in some cases it could be an easier way to learn to read.
I'm not sure I quite understand what you're asking. I think that yes, like the application of sound is like definitely important, and if a child can like on their own gather that this sound goes with this letter while they're watching their parent read, that's really cool, but it's not going to work for every kid because it needs to be more explicitly taught. But it might work for some kids, and that's really wonderful if it does. It's a whole lot easier.
And particularly in the areas of like learning disabilities,
Yeah.
that they can't, it's just different animals, so what strategy would work to help teach them as well?
Mm-hmm. We're trying to find if there's like a catch-all, which who knows? Yeah.
You mentioned the example of studying irregular verbs in a second language.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was really interesting. Did you encounter much in your reading about this topic, about the insights that we can gain from studying a second, and especially more than just a second, but a 3rd or 4th language?
Yeah.
Especially for the first thing that you started off by pointing out to us, which is that we don't have voluntary recall of that experience that we had when we were 2 or 3 or 5 years old. Because it seems to me that if you study a series of languages, you trigger those memories for which you don't have voluntary recall, and you start to gain some insights about how you learned to do those things.
Yeah, definitely something that I want to look into more in the future. That's why it was part of our like future study thing.
Because I would definitely say the scope of our research was like, how does like current American-based English systems, do we teach that in schools? So we didn't really take a look at anything outside of like learning basic English, but definitely, as Brooke was saying, going forward in the future, looking at, incorporating other languages and like learning them together as a way to teach English more effectively as well.
And it's interesting, like a lot of like what we think of as how we learn to read with an alphabet and sounds, not every language is like that. And I did encounter some of that in my reading of like different types of languages that use syllables as their basic unit instead of letters. And so I think that there's a lot more to be studied on that for sure.
Did you guys, in your research at all, look at how technology is impacting reading, especially with like text slang, and how kids are just like reading their parents' text or learning text at a really young age, and thereby developing like text slang and misspelling errors?
You know, that would be really interesting. We didn't really look into that very much. There's a lot of good technological tools to help struggling readers, like read aloud things. I said I'm an education major, so I've spent a lot of time in classrooms, and I've seen kids like using their school-issued iPads in a positive way when it's helping them to read something that they can't quite grasp on their own. So I think there's a lot of good with technology and learning reading, but there could probably also be some harmful side effects, and I'm not really sure about that. That'd be interesting.
I would also add that in some of the preliminary research that I was looking into, what I found was that there is a downturn in spelling and comprehension across like national levels. And the study didn't indicate what that was for, but I definitely could probably argue that's probably one of the main reasons. There's just not enough information out there right now.
Another thing is in my educational psychology class that I took last year, we talked about how we almost use our phones as like an outside brain. Like people don't remember phone numbers or like addresses anymore because they have it all right there. And so I think that could be a negative impact, is like keeping your memory outside instead of your head.
we thank you all for coming. Unfortunately, we're out of time.
Yes, thank you for coming. We have a handout that you can grab on your way out with a couple of QR codes. One is to a podcast that gives more information about this topic, and one is to that document that has the list of spelling rules and how often all of them are broken. So if you want to take one of those on your way out, thank you for coming. We do need to clear it out because we have another presentation after. But